He had never imagined that life could change so fast. One day he was walking through the streets minding his own business, thinking about work and family, and the next everything was turned upside down. The world he knew, the one filled with small routines, the occasional laughter with neighbors and quiet evenings at home, was gone in a flash. He had been arrested. The charges were vague, confusing, and completely untrue, but that made no difference. The police were certain, and the court had accepted their story. In his mind, he couldn't understand why fate had chosen him for this cruel twist. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, facing a future that felt like a dark tunnel with no light at the end. From the moment he stepped into the prison, he knew he had entered a completely different world. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a mix of sweat, fear, and anger. The sound of shouting echoed down long, narrow hallways, and the sight of men huddled in corners, their eyes wary and calculating, made him instinctively tense. Everything about this place was designed to break people. He had heard stories, of course. Stories about hardened criminals, gangs ruling over weaker inmates, and fights breaking out over the smallest things. But hearing stories was one thing. Being there was something entirely different. He tried to keep his head down. He walked slowly, trying not to draw attention, aware of every glance and movement around him. Every step felt heavy, and every passing inmate seemed to size him up. He realized quickly that in prison it was all about perception. If someone thought you were weak, that perception would be exploited mercilessly. If someone thought you were a threat, they would watch you closely, waiting for a mistake. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to survive and eventually somehow find a way out of this nightmare. It didn't take long for him to notice the prison gangs. They moved with a quiet confidence that sent shivers down the spine of anyone watching. They didn't need to shout to assert themselves. Their presence alone was enough. The leader of the gang, a man with sharp eyes and a cold, calculating demeanor, seemed to command attention without even speaking. Others followed, eager to do his bidding and maintain their place in the hierarchy. He had heard the whispers before. This gang didn't tolerate outsiders, and they especially didn't forgive anyone who accidentally or intentionally crossed them. He had no desire to cross anyone, but he knew that in a place like this, being in the wrong place at the wrong time could make you a target. In the first few days, he tried to understand the unspoken rules. Every look, every word, every movement mattered. He observed silently, noting who was friendly, who was dangerous, and who preferred to stay invisible. He quickly realized that friendships in prison were fragile. Some inmates were eager to ally themselves with anyone who might offer protection, while others were willing to betray at the first sign of weakness. Trust was a rare commodity here, and he had to learn fast who could be trusted and who could not. It was during one of his walks through the yard that he first noticed the gang taking interest in him. At first it was small things, a sharp look from the corner of an eye, a subtle whisper that stopped when he approached. Then one day, as he sat quietly during a meal, a member of the gang brushed past him deliberately, knocking over his tray. The food spilled and he froze, unsure whether to react or ignore it. A few others laughed, their voices low and threatening. He tried to remain calm, picking up what he could of his meal and moving on, hoping it would end there. But he knew, deep down, it would not. The days passed and the tension grew. The gang began testing him more openly, making small threats, blocking his path, and trying to intimidate him. He realized that they were sizing him up, seeing if he would break, seeing if he would react in fear. It was a dangerous game, and he had to play it carefully. He couldn't show weakness, but he also couldn't start a fight that he might not be able to control. Every choice felt like a life-or-death decision. At night, in the quiet moments when the prison was still, he thought about his life outside. Memories of family and friends flooded his mind, making him long for freedom even more. He remembered the simple things, walking through his neighborhood, sharing a meal with loved ones, laughing without fear. Those memories were bittersweet because they reminded him of what he had lost, yet they also gave him a sense of hope. If he could survive this, if he could navigate this harsh world, then maybe one day he could return to that life. Despite his fear, there was something inside him that refused to give up. He had always faced challenges in life, and this was the greatest one yet. He began observing the gang more closely, noting their routines, their weaknesses, and the way they interacted with each other. Even in a place full of danger, he found that his mind could still be a tool, a way to survive. Strategy and careful thinking became his armor. even when his body felt trapped. One afternoon, an incident occurred that made him realize the seriousness of his situation. While walking through a corridor, a gang member deliberately bumped into him and spat on the floor near his feet. A few others laughed, clearly waiting for him to react. He felt anger rise inside, but he controlled it, keeping his voice calm and his movements slow. He could feel the eyes of other inmates on him, waiting to see if he would lose control. He took a deep breath, looked away, and continued walking. That small act of restraint made a difference. It showed that he could be defiant without being reckless. The prison staff noticed him too, though they were mostly indifferent. They didn't interfere unless violence became unavoidable. It was clear that he would have to rely on his own instincts to survive. He spent hours thinking about every step he took, every interaction he had. Every small decision could have huge consequences. He had no illusions. Prison was a dangerous place, and survival required both intelligence and patience. He also began to notice the subtle alliances forming around him. Some inmates offered small gestures of help, sharing food, giving warnings, or simply not interfering when he passed. He realized that not everyone was against him, and that careful observation and respect could earn him allies even in the harshest environment. These small connections became lifelines, reminding him that humanity could exist even in a place built to crush it. As the days turned into weeks, he started to develop a rhythm. He learned which areas were dangerous at certain times, which inmates to avoid, and how to keep his presence from becoming a target. Every small success gave him confidence. He knew the gang would continue to test him, but he also knew that he could survive as long as he remained vigilant and smart. Yet beneath the surface, he kept a secret. Most people didn't know about the skills he carried with him, the discipline and training that had shaped his life before this. He had learned to remain calm under pressure, to think several steps ahead and to act decisively when necessary. These qualities, invisible to most, would become critical in the days to come. For now he remained cautious, blending in, observing, and preparing for the moment when he would have to face the real challenge, the gang that had set its sights on him. Despite the fear, there was also a sense of determination. He had been through hardships before, and he knew that survival required more than just avoiding trouble. It required understanding people, understanding the environment, and understanding oneself. He began to see the prison not just as a place of punishment, but as a place that tested every ounce of his courage and intelligence. In the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he made a promise to himself. He would not let this place break him. He would survive. He would navigate the dangers, and he would do so with his dignity intact. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but he knew one thing for sure. He was not an ordinary man, and he would not be treated as one, and so, in those first weeks of his incarceration, he learned the most important lesson of all. Survival in prison was about more than strength. It was about patience, observation, and control. Every glance, every step, and every word mattered. And while the gang believed they had chosen an easy target, they had no idea that the man they were watching so closely was far from defenseless. He was quiet, observant, and careful, but beneath that calm exterior lay a mind trained to face danger in ways that few could imagine. He didn't know it yet, but the real test was coming. The gang would escalate, and soon, he would have to reveal the skills he had kept hidden for so long. For now, he remained vigilant, blending into the shadows, preparing for the moment when survival would require more than observation. It would require action. But he was ready. He had to be. In this world, only the alert and the smart survived, and he was determined to be among them. The days in prison grew heavier, and the tension surrounding him increased. It had become clear that the gang was no longer testing him gently. They were actively targeting him. The small incidents, which at first seemed like minor annoyances, had started to escalate. He noticed how they would follow him in the hallways, lingering just close enough to make him uneasy. Their presence was a silent threat, a constant reminder that in this place no one could relax. Every movement he made was watched. Every glance he threw over his shoulder was calculated. He had learned early that prison was a place where vigilance wasn't optional. It was a requirement for survival. The gang started to make their intentions more obvious. One day, while he was walking to the cafeteria, a group of them blocked his path. Their leader, A tall man with a cold, piercing stare stepped forward and deliberately bumped into him. The others snickered and whispered to each other, their amusement loud enough for everyone around to notice. He could feel the heat rising to his face, but he forced himself to stay calm. Anger would be dangerous here. Losing control could provoke violence he was not yet ready to face. He sidestepped slowly, keeping his voice steady, and murmured a quiet apology. The gang's laughter only grew louder. They enjoyed the fear and discomfort they could provoke, and he knew that showing restraint was only part of the challenge. He had to find a way to assert himself without losing control. As the days passed, the harassment became more calculated. Personal items were stolen from his small locker. His food was pushed off trays in the cafeteria, and whispers followed him wherever he went. He realized that the gang wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They wanted to make him weak in front of others, to mark him as someone who could be controlled. That was a dangerous position, and he understood that he had to handle it with both caution and strategy. He began to observe the gang carefully, noting their patterns and weaknesses. Some members were brash, acting quickly without thinking, while others were cunning and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By watching them closely, he started to understand the hierarchy within the group, the unspoken rules and the way authority was respected. It was a delicate ecosystem, and he knew that any wrong move could put him in serious danger. One day, the gang escalated their harassment in a way that surprised him. While he was in the yard, a gang member tripped him intentionally, sending him sprawling to the ground. The laughter and shouts of approval from others around were deafening. He felt his stomach tighten, but he did not retaliate physically. Instead, he picked himself up slowly, dusted off his clothes, and walked away with deliberate calm. It was a small victory, but an important one. By not reacting impulsively, he avoided giving them the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger in his eyes. Despite the constant stress, he found ways to protect himself. He memorized the routines of the gang members, identifying the times when they were less likely to be aggressive. He learned the blind spots in the prison's surveillance, the places where he could move without being noticed, and the small tricks that allowed him to avoid confrontation. Every day was a lesson in survival, and he became more skilled at navigating the dangerous social landscape of the prison. He also started to notice that other inmates were watching the same interactions. Some of them offered small, subtle signs of support, a shared glance, a piece of advice whispered in confidence, or simply leaving him alone when others might have interfered. He realized that not everyone was hostile. There were people who, like him, understood the value of strategy and patience over aggression. These quiet alliances, even if fragile, became a source of strength. They reminded him that survival didn't mean fighting everyone. It meant choosing battles wisely and building trust where it mattered. The gang, however, was relentless. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, a couple of members cornered him. They blocked the exit, laughing cruelly, and pushed him roughly against the wall. The smell of disinfectant mixed with fear as he struggled to maintain his composure. They expected a fight, or at least a flinch of fear. He stayed calm, carefully reading their movements and waiting for the right moment to respond. When they lunged, he sidestepped with fluid precision, using their momentum against them. It was not about hurting them badly. It was about showing that he could not be easily dominated. That small demonstration of skill and control changed the dynamic slightly. The gang members were surprised, not expecting such resistance from someone they had labeled as weak. They backed off, murmuring to each other, unsure of how to proceed. For him, it was a reminder that the most important weapon in this environment wasn't physical strength alone. It was discipline, intelligence, and the ability to act decisively when necessary. In the evenings, when he was alone in his cell, he reflected on the experiences of the day. The fear was always present, but it was now tempered by confidence. He realized that he had to be ready for anything, and that preparation was his greatest ally. He spent hours thinking through scenarios, considering what each gang member might do next and planning ways to protect himself. Every detail mattered, from the way he carried himself to the tone of his voice when speaking to others. In this environment, nothing could be taken for granted. He also began to understand the psychology of his attackers. They relied on fear, intimidation, and the perception of control. They thrived when others were scared, and their confidence grew when met with submission. By remaining calm and thoughtful, he began to disrupt their expectations. Each calculated reaction chipped away at their perception of him as an easy target. Slowly, he was learning to shift the balance, not through brute force but through careful, deliberate action. Despite the constant pressure, he kept a small spark of hope alive. He thought about life outside, imagining the streets, the people he loved, and the freedom he longed to regain. These thoughts were bittersweet. They reminded him of what he had lost, but they also gave him strength. He realized that surviving this place wasn't just about enduring. It was about preparing for the future, for the day when he could leave behind the fear, the violence, and the injustice. The gang, growing frustrated with his resistance, began plotting more aggressive moves. They wanted to make an example out of him, to remind everyone that no one could defy their authority. He sensed the rising tension, feeling the subtle signs of planning, whispered conversations and exchanged glances that carried unspoken threats. He understood that a confrontation was inevitable. What he didn't know yet was that when it came, he would need more than clever thinking. He would need the full extent of his training, the skills and discipline that he had honed long before arriving here. He began to prepare mentally, imagining the possible scenarios, rehearsing calm responses and anticipating moves. Every day, he became more aware of his surroundings, more attuned to subtle changes in tone, posture, and behavior. Survival in prison wasn't just about avoiding fights. It was about predicting them, controlling them, and when necessary, ending them decisively. In these moments, he realized something important. Fear could be a tool if used wisely. Understanding fear, both his own and that of others, gave him an edge. By remaining composed under pressure, he could influence the way people acted around him. He began to notice that some inmates were quietly watching him, taking note of his reactions, curious about how he would respond next. He was becoming a figure that others observed with respect, even if cautiously. As the days turned into weeks, the gang's attacks became more sporadic, less organized. His careful strategy was working. They could no longer predict his actions, and their confidence in their ability to control him was slipping. He wasn't seeking revenge, but he was asserting his presence in a subtle, intelligent way. In a place that thrived on chaos, he was calm. In a place that relied on intimidation, he was steady. Yet, he knew the real test was coming. The gang was planning something bigger, something that would force a confrontation. He didn't fear it because he was ready, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and strategically. He had learned to survive under pressure, to remain calm under threat, and to act with precision when the moment demanded it. In the quiet hours of the night, lying on his narrow bed, he thought about the path ahead. It would not be easy. The gang was relentless, dangerous, and unpredictable, but he had something they didn't expect: discipline, training, and a mind honed to handle pressure in ways they could not imagine. They thought they were in control, but he was quietly preparing, observing, and planning. When the confrontation came, they would discover that the man they had underestimated was far from ordinary. And so, in those weeks of careful observation, silent preparation, and small victories, he began to change the dynamics of the prison around him. He was no longer just a target. He was a player, someone who could influence events, who could survive challenges that others feared. The gang might have seen him as weak, but he knew the truth. He was ready for whatever came next. They might strike, but when they did, they would be facing someone who had trained his whole life to face danger and survive. The tension in the prison had reached a new level. The gang had tried to intimidate him for weeks, but nothing had worked the way they expected. Their attacks had become bolder, and they began to sense that he was no ordinary inmate. Every time they tried to corner him, he moved with a confidence and precision that left them frustrated and confused. Whispers began to circulate among the other prisoners. Some said he was lucky. Others said he had connections outside. Few guessed the truth. He was trained, disciplined, and capable in ways that went far beyond anyone's imagination. One afternoon, while he was walking through the yard, he noticed a gang member approaching him with a menacing grin. The man blocked his path while a few others flanked him on either side. They were clearly planning to make an example of him, to show everyone that no one could defy their authority. The crowd of inmates around them sensed what was about to happen and stepped back, creating a wide space for the confrontation. His heart did not race and his hands did not tremble. Instead, he stayed calm, assessing the situation. As the gang member stepped closer, he recognized the familiar signs of someone who relied on brute force without strategy. The man's movements were predictable, based on aggression rather than skill. It was almost too easy to read, and he knew that he could turn the situation in his favor if he stayed composed. His mind began running through options, analyzing each possible move and the outcome it would produce. Survival depended on anticipation and control, not panic. Suddenly, the gang member lunged at him. The crowd gasped. In a fluid motion, he sidestepped and used the attacker's momentum against him. The man stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance, and he took advantage of the opening to create distance. The surrounding inmates whispered, impressed by the speed and precision of his movements. The gang member scrambled to recover, but the balance of power had shifted. The man's confidence wavered, and the others began to hesitate. For the first time, they realized that the person they had been targeting was far more capable than they had imagined. It was in this moment, amid the chaos and tension, that flashes of his past began to surface. He remembered long hours of rigorous training, missions where every decision could mean life or death, and situations that demanded calm under pressure. In the military, he had faced danger constantly, learning to control fear and use it strategically. The instincts he had developed over years of training were now guiding his actions in this prison environment. He moved with precision, calculated every step, and remained calm when others would have panicked. The gang tried to regroup, exchanging hurried whispers and angry glances. They had underestimated him, thinking he was just another weak inmate. They did not realize that he had been trained to handle threats with intelligence and skill. They assumed that force alone would intimidate him. But force without strategy was ineffective against someone who understood the principles of discipline and control. With each failed attempt, their frustration grew, and the tension in the yard became palpable. Other inmates began to notice the shift in dynamics. Some watched in awe as he handled the situation with calm authority. They could sense that he was not just surviving, he was asserting himself in a way that commanded respect without provoking unnecessary violence. In a place where fear dictated behavior, he had found a way to control the perception of power. The gang members could see it too, though they refused to admit it openly. They had thought they could dominate him, but now they were forced to reconsider. After the initial confrontation, he moved to a quieter part of the yard, observing the gang from a distance. He was not looking for revenge, nor was he seeking a fight. He was assessing, analyzing, and planning. He realized that the gang's aggression stemmed from their need to maintain control and their fear of appearing weak. By remaining calm and strategic, he could disrupt their power without escalating the violence unnecessarily. Survival required patience, observation, and the careful use of skill. At night, in the quiet of his cell, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The memories of his past life were strong. The training, the missions, the discipline, and the lessons learned under extreme pressure. He had always known that these skills were not just physical, they were mental and emotional as well. In this prison, those same skills were proving invaluable. He thought about the way fear could be used strategically, how anticipation could prevent danger, and how calm, controlled action could neutralize threats without causing chaos. He realized something important. The gang had assumed they were dealing with someone ordinary, someone who would react with fear or anger. That assumption had been their mistake. He was not ordinary. His past, though hidden from most, gave him an edge they could not comprehend. It allowed him to see patterns, predict behavior, and respond effectively under pressure. And while he had kept these abilities concealed, the time was approaching when they might have to be revealed. The next day, the gang made another move. They cornered him near the showers, thinking that the confined space would give them the advantage. The air was tense, and the other inmates watched silently, sensing the danger. This time, the gang leader stepped forward, a man known for his brutality and cunning. He underestimated the man in front of him, assuming that he could force compliance through intimidation. The leader was confident, but he did not realize that confidence alone would not be enough. As the leader advanced, he observed every movement, every shift in weight, every subtle signal of intent. Years of training had taught him to read people, to anticipate actions before they happened. When the leader lunged with a shove, he moved with calculated precision, sidestepping and using the man's momentum to off-balance him. The others tried to intervene, but he remained composed, blocking and redirecting without panic. In the space of moments, the gang's plan had unraveled. The surrounding inmates were silent, watching closely as he maintained control of the situation. It was clear that this was not a fight driven by anger or revenge. It was a demonstration of skill, strategy, and control. The gang members were forced to retreat, muttering threats under their breath but clearly shaken by the experience. For the first time, they understood that they were dealing with someone far beyond their expectations. After the confrontation, he retreated to a corner of the yard and observed quietly. The gang had not given up, but their approach had changed. They were more cautious, less confident, and clearly trying to assess him before taking any further action. He had shifted the balance of power, not through brute force alone, but through intelligence, patience, and skill. The other inmates noticed this shift, and some began to regard him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. In his cell that night, he reflected on the day's events. The confrontations had tested his control, patience, and strategic thinking. They had reminded him of the importance of remaining calm under pressure and using skill rather than aggression to neutralize threats. He knew that the gang would continue to challenge him, but he also knew that he was ready. He had survived dangerous situations before, and he would survive here as well. The realization that he was no ordinary inmate became clearer with each encounter. The gang had underestimated him from the start, assuming that he could be intimidated and controlled. That assumption had been their mistake. He had training, experience, and discipline that they could not anticipate. And while he had kept these abilities hidden, the moments of confrontation had begun to reveal glimpses of the truth. He also recognized that his actions were influencing others in subtle ways. Other inmates began to observe him, some with quiet admiration, others with cautious respect. Even those who had previously ignored him were now aware of his presence and his capabilities. In a place driven by fear and intimidation, he had created a small zone of influence through calm authority and strategic thinking. Despite the growing tension, he remained focused on survival rather than revenge. He understood that unnecessary violence could escalate the situation and put him at greater risk. Instead, he relied on observation, anticipation, and controlled action to maintain his safety. His approach was deliberate, patient, and precise, a reflection of the discipline that had guided him throughout his life. He also began to anticipate the gang's next moves. By studying their behavior, their routines, and their reactions, he could predict potential threats before they occurred. This foresight gave him a significant advantage, allowing him to avoid danger and prepare for confrontations on his terms. It was a mental game as much as a physical one, and he excelled at both. As the days went on, the gang's aggression became less chaotic and more measured. They had learned that brute force alone would not defeat him, and they were forced to approach him with caution. Each encounter reinforced his understanding of the environment and his ability to navigate it successfully. He was no longer just surviving. He was asserting his presence, influencing the dynamics of the prison, and preparing for the challenges ahead. In the quiet of the night, he reflected on the lessons he had learned. Patience, observation, and strategic action were more powerful than anger or aggression. Fear could be managed and used as a tool, and discipline was the foundation of survival. He knew that the gang would continue to pose a threat, but he also knew that he was ready. The skills he had honed over years of experience had prepared him for this moment, and he would use them to ensure that he survived and emerged stronger. And so, as the days turned into weeks, he moved through the prison with a quiet confidence. He observed, calculated, and acted with precision, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The gang had underestimated him, but that mistake would soon become apparent. When the confrontation escalated further, they would face not just an ordinary inmate, but a man with the skill, discipline, and determination to survive and to prevail. The tension in the prison had reached a boiling point. The gang had tried countless times to intimidate him, but nothing had worked. Every attack had failed. Every attempt to dominate him had been met with calm precision. The other inmates had begun to notice, and whispers of his skill and control spread quietly through the blocks. The gang, once confident and fearless, had grown cautious. But caution did not mean surrender. They were frustrated, and frustration often led to reckless decisions. It began with a small ambush in the yard. They tried to surround him, blocking his path to the benches where inmates gathered. The sun was high and the yard was full of people, but the gang thought the crowd would distract him. They were wrong. He moved slowly, observing every movement, calculating distances, and assessing their positioning. Every member of the gang had a tell, a subtle shift in weight, the way they flexed their hands, the glance they gave their allies. He noticed it all, the way he had been trained to notice, and used it to anticipate their next moves. The first man lunged at him recklessly, aiming to push him into the wall. He sidestepped with fluid precision, letting the man's momentum carry him forward. Instead of striking back immediately, he used a controlled movement to redirect the attacker, placing him off balance. The other gang members tried to intervene, but he had already calculated the safest way to neutralize the immediate threat without causing chaos. One by one they approached, testing him, but he met each advance with calm, measured movements. The crowd of inmates began to murmur. Some watched in awe, others held their breath. The gang's confidence was faltering. They realized that they had underestimated him in every possible way. The more they attacked, the more it became clear that they were predictable and impulsive, while he was patient, precise, and deliberate. Every dodge, every shift of weight, every calculated step sent a clear message. He could not be easily controlled. The leader of the gang, growing desperate, tried to escalate the situation. He shouted commands, ordering his allies to surround him from different angles. They moved like a unit, attempting to corner him, but they underestimated his awareness and spatial understanding. He moved with a quiet authority, predicting their movements, creating subtle openings, and using the environment to his advantage. He didn't need brute strength. He needed observation, timing, and control. The first skirmish ended with the gang members stumbling or losing their balance, frustrated and surprised by his responses. None were seriously hurt, but the lesson was clear. He was not someone to be toyed with. The gang backed off momentarily, reassessing their approach. They whispered among themselves, exchanging glances that showed doubt and frustration. For the first time, the idea that they might have met someone they could not control had entered their minds, but they did not give up. Over the next few days, they tried again, this time with a more organized strategy. They attempted to isolate him in the laundry room, a confined space where they thought numbers would give them the advantage, but he had anticipated this possibility. As he moved toward the laundry area, he noticed the subtle signs. A slight hesitation from an inmate, a glance exchanged between two men, a misstep that seemed out of place. He recognized these cues immediately, understanding that the gang had planned an ambush. Inside the laundry room, they attempted to surround him. The space was narrow, with tables and equipment that could easily become obstacles. He did not panic. Instead, he used the layout to his advantage. He positioned himself so that each gang member's movement could be predicted and controlled. When one lunged, he deflected the motion smoothly, guiding the attacker past him. When another tried to swing, he sidestepped, redirecting the force without striking harshly. His training allowed him to neutralize threats without creating unnecessary chaos. The gang members grew frustrated and reckless. They expected him to panic, to react emotionally, to strike out in fear. But he did none of these things. His movements were calm, deliberate, and precise. Every step was calculated to maintain control while minimizing risk. The more they attacked, the more they revealed their own weaknesses: impatience, overconfidence, and lack of strategy. He exploited each flaw quietly, turning their aggression against them without raising his own voice or losing composure. Outside the laundry room, other inmates watched through the open doors and small windows. Some were amazed, others were fearful. Few had seen someone move with such calm authority in a direct confrontation. It became clear that this was not just about survival. It was about presence, control, and strategic thinking. He was asserting power not through intimidation or cruelty, but through skill, patience, and calculated action. The gang's morale was slipping. The leader's shouts became louder, more desperate, but authority could not overcome skill. Each member, one by one, realized that brute force alone would not succeed. Frustration began to overtake them. One man tripped over a piece of laundry equipment, another collided with a table, and the leader's plan started falling apart. The scene was chaotic, but only for the gang. He remained calm, navigating the space with awareness and control, moving when necessary, standing still when it provided advantage. By the time the skirmish ended, the gang had backed away. Their frustration and confusion were evident. They had attempted to dominate him using fear, intimidation, and numbers, but he had neutralized the threats without resorting to anger or violence. The other inmates now regarded him differently. The quiet man who had seemed vulnerable days before had revealed strength that was precise, controlled, and undeniable. He had shown that authority did not always come from aggression. It could come from discipline and intelligence. In the following days, the gang became more cautious. They observed him, trying to anticipate his actions, but he continued to control the environment. He used every opportunity to study their routines, learn their weaknesses, and predict their next moves. He moved carefully, always aware of space, distance, and timing. His presence alone began to influence the behavior of others. Even those who were not directly involved in the conflicts adjusted their movements around him, respecting the calm authority he had demonstrated. The prison staff noticed the subtle shift as well. Though they rarely interfered directly, they observed the gang's changing behavior and the way other inmates responded to him. His ability to maintain composure under pressure, to read situations accurately, and to act decisively without aggression set him apart. He was no longer a passive observer. He was a force to be reckoned with, a presence that demanded consideration and respect. He also understood that the situation was not just about surviving attacks. It was about preventing future threats. By demonstrating skill and control, he subtly influenced the gang's perception of him. They were cautious now, unsure if any attack would succeed. Their fear, though quiet and restrained, was present. In a place where perception controlled behavior, he had shifted the balance. He had become more than just a target. He had become a deterrent. Every day he moved with awareness, observing, learning, and adapting. He understood the importance of strategy, patience, and timing. Each encounter with the gang provided information, and he used it to maintain an advantage. He did not seek to dominate through violence, but he knew that he could act decisively if necessary. The discipline and experience he had carried into this environment gave him control that others could not match. By the end of the week, the gang's approach had changed completely. They no longer sought to attack him openly. Instead, they tried to test him subtly, through indirect challenges and minor provocations. He handled each one calmly, using observation and calculated responses. Their attempts to intimidate him had failed repeatedly, and they now moved with caution and uncertainty. The balance of power had shifted, and he had established a quiet authority without ever raising his voice or striking unnecessarily. In his cell at night, he reflected on the events. Survival in the prison was not about brute strength alone. It was about intelligence, discipline, and control. Fear could be managed and used strategically, and patience was a weapon as powerful as any physical skill. He had learned to navigate this dangerous environment by observing, anticipating, and acting decisively when necessary. The gang had underestimated him, and now they faced the consequences of that mistake. He also knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The gang might attempt more aggressive moves, and he would need to be ready. But for now, he had demonstrated that he was not to be underestimated. He had survived repeated attacks, controlled dangerous situations, and influenced the perception of power within the prison. His skills, honed over years of experience and training, were making a difference. The days that followed were quieter, but he remained vigilant. The gang observed from a distance, careful and wary. Other inmates respected him, some seeking subtle guidance or protection, while others simply gave space. He had created an environment in which his presence commanded attention, and his reputation quietly spread. Survival was no longer a passive effort. It was an active, calculated presence, influencing behavior and shaping the dynamics of the prison without unnecessary violence. And so, as the weeks continued, he moved through the prison with quiet confidence. He observed, calculated, and acted with precision, maintaining control over his environment and preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. The gang had learned to